Hey, friendos, it is I, DrBossKey, and today I thought I would do something a little different. Most of the tips and tricks videos that I make are more on the advanced spectrum. So I do answer and go through the basics, but not as often because there's also other videos out there. I'll link those later on for you as well. And what I've been finding is that sometimes Shmup Creator developers will buy Shmup Creator, and then they will take a look at one of my first tutorials on like how to do boss scripting, and then their brains just go it's kind of crazy, right? And I'm probably 1,300 hours ish into Shmup Creator, so I find that as I discover advanced ways to do things, I like to document those and do tutorial videos for that. So instead of doing that, I thought I would do this video, which is kind of just a general overview of welcoming you to the Shmup Creator community. Welcome aboard for doing development, and here's some food for thought if you're just really starting out. I'll also have a link to this presentation in the description for the video, and then there's a bunch of other links to cool resources and things from there. So why don't we jump over? It's hard not to go into rabbit holes. Okay, so creating a shoot 'em up with Shmup Creator. We just talked about that. Welcome. So probably one of the things that you want to do is you want to start thinking about just taking baby steps, starting in the Shmup Creator software, taking a look at some of the samples. You have a full license to sell your games with Shmup Creator. You can only deploy to PC, so there's no consoles or anything else. So just be aware of that limitation. I think you'll have a lot of fun. You can deploy to itch.io, you can deploy to Steam, anything you want. You can make your executables and share them with friends. So yeah, so some things to think about: tools and software requirements. You've got Shmup Creator; it's important. You're going to need some kind of graphic software package for making your textures. So for instance, Photoshop or GIMP. GIMP is free. So, and that's, there's a whole other deep rabbit hole you can go down with trying to figure out, your own tools and development process. But this is something you want to think about, right? These are going to become your workflows. You're not going to make a game in just a couple hours. And, when you take these bigger projects, having a method to the madness and how you do it is important, right? So you should also be aware that you can do 2D games or you can do 3D games. So if you have any 3D modeling experience, or you buy models and things like that, if you're familiar with working with other game engines, there's an import pipeline and flow. So it's all possible. And probably the other thing you should do for yourself is you should get a controller. So mouse and keyboard completely supported, of course. But I think what you'll find is that because Shmup Creator allows for game controllers to be used basically out of the box, then people are going to play your game potentially with a controller. Sometimes we'll play the mouse and keyboard, and so you want to be able to play test with both to make sure everything feels well, because you can customize your analog stick dead zones, their sensitivity, how fast things move. So there's lots of cool stuff you can do right out of the box, and you wouldn't want to make it only with keyboard and then find out that people are playing with a controller and it's not the experience you wanted. So we can talk about this a little bit more, but you want some way to essentially have version control for your assets. And at the very base sense, it can be as simple as making a copy of your game directory and storing it elsewhere, but you want to make a place where you can have iterations. There are other tools like Perforce or GitHub, things like that. Those might be big overkill pieces of software for you, but the concept remains the same. So, and you can use something like Dropbox or Google Drive to make backups and copies of all of your game assets. Don't make that your primary game directory, but yeah, so you just wanted to do some thinking about that. So food for thought. So setting up your game environment. So basically, we talked about how you want to manage your assets a little bit. Maybe I should go back into this space. So for instance, hopping over to Shmup Creator. This is just a tutorial test project I have going. But once you fire this up, you have Reveal and Explore. So, and in Explorer here, you can see that this game is called My New Game. right? So let me back up all the way together. So Hulu Studio is obviously the makers of Shmup Creator. There's a games folder in here, and this will install to, you install it through Steam, so you need to look at where it's going to install for you, but you'll find it. Here there's a game section, so it comes with also some game examples that you can load and play with. So super cool there. Let me take a look here. So for instance, if you, is it here? Load, yeah, so up in the corner here, sorry, that's probably a little fast. So up in the corner here, you have load or create game. And for instance, Blades of Death is a example project that comes with Shmup Creator. So there, it has one level. So you want to load that level after you've loaded the project. And this is really cool. So this is a 3D game. So up here, you have your different camera perspectives. So I like to go into perspective camera. So this gives you the ability, if you middle mouse click, you can click and drag around. If you mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out. And also, if you hold the shift button, you can accelerate how fast things move around. So if you press the tab button on the keyboard, that'll put you into runtime. And here, you can see, right? Super cool. Like, this is great. This comes right out of the box. And because this, you can tell these are 3D assets, right? But this gives you a sense for how the game is built. Whether it's 3D or 2D, the interface is still pretty much the same. But these are great ways for you to study on how to do things. So you can come to the enemies box. I won't get too far in this. But for instance, here's watchtowers, right? And so here is the camera. So let's see here. So here's the player. Here's the camera. Yeah, okay. So it's the player, you have the player controller, and then here's what the camera sees. So the outer white line is the look ahead. So this isn't what the player sees. This is what the camera sees, and the inner yellow area is what the camera sees. So for instance, we can come in here. Here's a watchtower. You can hold the shift key. You can duplicate this, and you can do something like this, right? Now you can see all of those, and you're like, oh wait, that's way too many, or maybe you want to align them differently, right? And you're like, oh, we need to do something like this. How freaking awesome is that? Pretty freaking cool. So the rule of thumb is you don't worry about breaking things. There's plenty of samples. There's a lot, like, it's very hard to break things with the tool. It's not impossible. There are some crashes here and there. The developers work to fix those as they come up, but I digress. So anyways, I'm getting a little off the beaten path here. So the reason why we went in there is because we were talking about how to manage assets, right? So here you have in the games directory, so that is Blade. So here's my project, it's called DBK. And inside of DBK, I have an assets folder. And this is what comes as part of the setup. So, and under assets, you can go into models. You see you have backgrounds, bullets, enemies. We'll go to enemies. There's 3D and sprites. Sprites are 2D. And here you can see that there are, these are my different enemy types, right? So a good rule of thumb for you is, now that you kind of have an idea of how this is structured, one of the things I did is, back to games. I have in the games directory folder, outside of your main project, I have a folder I call Master Art Assets. And it's basically a clone of what's used by the engine. So I can go to assets, for instance. I can go to models. I can go to enemies. I can go to sprites. And here is where I basically keep all the files that allow me to construct the enemies that I have. So I have early iterations of the enemy types. I have my sprite sheets here. I have a separate folder for how I handle the death supporting art assets that I have. So, and that's a whole other series. But the key here, right, is that I have let's see, the important takeaway for you is this, is that when you make a build in Shmup Creator, all the files that are inside your game directory are going to be packed up and put into your game. And you don't want your Photoshop files and your extra wave files, and you don't want all your support, you don't want your other revisions, you want all of those to be in your game folder. You want your game to be as small as possible, easy to download, and you don't want to include a bunch of files that are just going to take up disk space. So I hope that makes sense. Some food for thought. Anyways, I want to make sure I keep us somewhat on track here. So we talked about version control, software we talked about a little bit as well, and then project organization. So there's some things to think about. Welcome aboard. So one of the first things you're going to want to do after you're done playing with things and look at tutorials is you want to create your player craft, right? And depending on whether you want to do a horizontal shmup or a vertical shmup, that is going to change the orientation of your player character, right? And in Shmup Creator, if you go to the game editor and then there's a game setting, you can, and when you start a brand new project, it'll ask you, do you want a horizontal or do you want a vertical shmup? And that just changes the orientation because the Shmup Creator engine is basically a 3D engine. And then it can do 2D by locking the perspective, right? So, because these are 3D, since it's 3D space, it changes the rotation of enemies when you bring them in. So, yeah, so that's food for thought for you. Then you want to, you basically want to iterate, right? Probably the most important things is what are you going to control? How are you going to control it? And then how's it going to shoot? How's it going to interact? So this is probably one of the first places you want to start in defining your player movement and controls. There's other tutorials and helper documentation on this, but this is a good overview. And probably your next thing is you want to think about creating enemy characters, right? So what type of enemies do you want to have? What's their, are they going to move? Do they follow the player? Or do they shoot things that follow the player? So you should be aware right now that there isn't any enemy AI. Enemy AI is based on what's called waypoints, which are splines for them to move around if you want. And then they have the ability to target the player with bullets and to shoot the player. And then you have all kinds of cool things you can customize to create enemies. They can also, if an enemy collides or a player collides with the enemy can do damage. There's lots of things you can tweak. You can make copies of your weapons and things like that as a starting point. And because Shmup Creator comes with a lot of assets, as I was kind of showing you earlier, you can, as a starting point, come in here and start to take a look at oh, hey, there's this enemy tower, right? So here, look at all the different things you can do. You can look at the gameplay, how many hit points it has, what kind of score it does, if you get score when you hit it. So lots of different things that you can do. Also, you can flip into the weapon manager. And so for instance, this gives you a really nice preview of how the enemy guard towers shoot at the player, right? You can see this is the weapon locator and it does a little bit of wiggle for variety and it belches out a bunch of those. But the cool part about Shmup Creator is all the projects contain these assets, and you can do something like you can duplicate the weapon. For instance, never name anything the same in your project. Little pro tip. Test 1, all right? And you can select that, and then you can come in here and you have all these different things you can customize. The skin of the bullet, but the effects, how it shoots with the burst, all kinds of stuff. So rule of thumb is you can make copies of stuff, get in there, poke around, play with things. You're not gonna be able to break a whole lot, which is great. And that's a good way to really, I think about your game and what you want to do and be inspired, because once you get a better understanding for the limitations of what is there, creatively speaking, creative constraints, you have a better understanding on how to start creating your enemies. So, all right. And then next up is adding weapons and power-ups, right? If you don't, how do you shoot? What type of weapons do you shoot? And I did another video on this, so we won't cover that too much, but you should think about how you are going to change the player weapons. Where in our case for the game, we have weapons that shoot out of the top. We have weapons that shoot out of the bottom. They're mapped to 2 different buttons. And then we have an automatic weapon in the middle as utility. So, and each one of these represents a different weapon set, which is changing through all 3 of these types of weapons whenever you pick it up. And then we also have a super power up. We have a health power up. We have a special mode power up that we did here. And then we have energy and a generic power up that also helps the player progress. So you need to be able to upgrade weapons or not, and be able to think about how that's going to affect your shmup, right? So good to think about it. Good to figure out how to play with these things in the engine and to think about those in your early designs. All right. So another item, another important thing to think about is how do you want to create your game levels? So here's an example of our game where we're using more of a Gradius style level design, where we have pillars that the player has to dodge through, right? We have some enemy placement here. And then basically we have some geometry where we built together like the upper and lower constraints. The player can hit any of these things and take damage. So this is the style again we built. But flipping back over to Shmup Creator for a second, I can just go here and I'll give you a quick. We don't need to save that. I'll give you a quick overview. So. Let's see. So not all of our levels are Gradius style. So we only have a couple levels that are in this style, but they're fun to do. Come on, load. Come on, load. All right. So going into perspective mode, so a couple things that are important. So here we built tiles, right? You can see these here. So each one of these is individual. And up here, you have the ability to snap 3D objects to 3D objects. So even if it's a 2D object, they will still snap together. So don't let that trip you up. And then you can also snap objects to grid corners. So you can see here in Shmup Creator, there's these grid corners, right? Or this grid that helps with alignment. And again here, in our game, the white line indicates what the camera can see. So enemies can wake up in the outside of the camera and then fly in. The inner side is where what's actually being seen by the player, right? And so level design, if you go in this direction, if you hold the shift key down, again, we talked about, right? So you can see here that these snap together, and maybe I want to create like a little platform. So I can easily do this and then just snap my pieces together. And then you can basically, you can hit the tab key, go into your runtime, take damage in this case, and this gives you the ability to essentially design your levels. And now maybe you don't want to have geometry. That's not a huge deal because you can be constrained by your cameras. There's some more advanced stuff here, but most importantly, just know that you have these parameters that are going to help you design your levels. You know, you have the way you set up enemies. You have very, very fast, rapid iteration. And that's super valuable for you iterating through gameplay. Also, probably the other thing is you have the timeline scroller here. So, and if you grab the timeline bar, you can see you can move through your level. So you can design, you don't have to play through from the beginning to the end each time just to get to that next spot, right, of your level to do the designs. Super, super helpful. Shmup Creator is amazing. This is one of the reasons why I enjoy working with it, because it is very quick and fast to iterate with. I've used other game engines and there's nothing quite like this, which means pound for pound, what you're able to achieve is quite a lot. It's amazing. All right, yeah, so with that, let's go to the next. So playtesting and tuning. So we already talked about the tab key, rapid iteration. You can make builds and share them pretty quickly with other friends in the community. You can hop over to the Shmup Creator Discord community. We often will share builds there and playtest for each other and provide feedback. We talked about the camera timeline. We talked about the rapid runtime, also editor runtime. So come back into this. If you hit the space bar, and again, this is perspective camera, so you could also be, you could be in the camera, or you can be in the game camera. And if you hit the space bar, then you can still see the editor and how things are set up. Or you can hit the tab and then you can start where you're at in the level and go to perspective here. You can also hit the space bar and see kind of how your level objects are. So you can see here, these guys are about to wake up. They actually start shooting from off screen, something I changed there. But it gives you options, which is super important for being able to craft and do your gameplay. All right, well, let me get us out of here. All right, the editor runtime we just talked about, and also we just talked about the Discord community. So you want to join us? Join us, one of us. We're a fantastic small group of folks, very, very passionate, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to serve and just be part of the community. So, what was this? Weapon apps, power ups. play testing and tuning. All right, tips and tricks. Okay, we're cool. All right, I didn't want to make this too long. So here's the cool part. Like I said, I'll publish this presentation in the video itself, so be in the description. And from here, there are all these cool links. So don't be afraid to experiment. We talked about that, right? The Shmup Creator Toolset is fantastic, and there's a lot you can do. You know, when in doubt, make a copy of the thing you want to mess around with, and just iterate. So there is this really cool video called "Making a Bullet Hell." It doesn't have to be bullet hell. This is over on the Shmup Creator website itself. I'm going to show you the best part about this is they just lead you through. And you can play your game within basically 60 minutes, all the cool stuff you can do. It's a little bit more in depth, but it's a great starting point. So, also, Shmup Creator documentation. So the cool part is the developers are active, and as they continue to tweak and iterate and roll out features for Shmup Creator, they do a great job updating the documentation. Don't be afraid of it. You want to come in and you want to basically read through all of it, right? And when you forget, your first step is to come in and take a look at maybe some of the areas. So if you read through it once, you might be like, oh yeah, I sort of remember some of the parameters I could set up for under the basics, right? So if under the basics you're like, oh, here's the placing and selecting game objects. You're like, okay, cool. Here's a little like, this is how we do that. Here's the different types of things you can place and what they do. And mainly just trying to remember that you can come back and search documentation. Also, this is pretty cool, right? So coming back into Shmup Creator, if you come over to the help button, that will take you to the same thing. So it's right there inside the engine. So don't forget it's there. Super, super helpful. I often find myself coming back to reference this. And again, it's a living document. So super cool. All right. So we talked about the Shmup Creator Discord server, right? So I just put in a link to that, but basically, don't be afraid of Discord. So one of the cool parts in Shmup Creator is we have a little help section. So here we try to help each other out with questions. So all good stuff, right? Here's a place where you can report bugs. Also, we love sharing. Like, making games is hard. You're going to be signed up for a good amount of time. It might be. Some people have been working on their games for years. Some people have been working on the games for months. Sometimes it's hard to keep that momentum. Life gets in the way sometimes, you know, and it's really encouraging to see people post what they're doing when they find cool tips and tricks. And so you go to show your creations, and you get floored because you come in and you look at stuff like, oh, like look at this is from Alec, and Alec is about ready to release his game pretty soon. And it's very, very cool to both be able to share the stuff you're doing, and then also we post builds here for us to play test and help each other out. So, all right. So the other thing here is we have this thing called the Shmup Creator Public Roadmap. So it's just a Trello board, and you have to, I think you can see it without being logged in, which is totally fine. But if you want to log in and vote on cards, so this gives you basically a sense for what the roadmap is. Here, so you can see the items coming into the next update, what are already in the versions, what's in progress. Sunny does a great job updating here. And also you can take a look at like, hey, like 8 hours ago, this is what Sunny's working on. This is what he's working on. So this gives you a sense for what's coming down the road, but also you can come to, because it's just a website, you can Control F, and you can look at like, hey, what's the, are there any suggestions for bullets? And then you can just basically go through and you can see all the different suggestions for bullets. I won't go too deeply into this. I try to help maintain and keep this rocking. The other thing that you can do is you can go into cards, for instance, and you can vote. So you can cast a vote. That'll put a 1 vote there. And so the developers can come and take a look at the backlog and see by the amount of votes what the community wants the most. Doesn't mean it'll necessarily be worked on, because there's a roadmap that's probably years long at this point. But I wanted you to be aware that it exists, and that you can have your input. You can add suggestions. Often what I do is I copy these over to the Trello board, and we go from there. So yeah. All right, let's see, take a look at that. We did that. Okay, so that's the roadmap itself. We talked about starting with samples to learn about iteration, so that's a great place to start. Also, there is a series that I've been working on, which is called the DrBossKey Shmup Creator Tips and Tricks. Here it's sorted by, for the most part, the amount of views. So you can see here, Shmup Creator, boss logic, and scripting tips. It's a pretty advanced tutorial video, but there's quite a bit of things. So often what I do is I come in here and I'm like, oh, hey, controls. You know, what's is there anything there? So for instance, there's a Shmup Creator control input tuning, analog stick, D-pad, right? So I'm like, oh, hey, what about enemies? Oh, Shmup Creator snake enemy type, how to add and animate body and tail hidden features. So feel free to cruise through any of these, ask questions. I continue to add to the series, and sometimes as we get new questions, I will add more to these to just help the community out. So thank you very much for watching. And probably the last thing, this is a real gem. So BogHog is a very enthusiastic Shmup developer. He's worked on and released several games at this point, not with Shmup Creator, but he has the BogHog Shmup Workshop series. And if you don't know about this, this is, you know, get some food, sit down, watch, and just watch how he breaks down quite a few things. He did a document, I know, like about a year, maybe 2 ago, that I also read through, and he turned this recently into a video tutorial series. So there's some really great stuff on like bullet pattern designs, visibility in shmups, and let's see here, let's see, movement, shooting, and hitboxes. So amazing. Thank you, BogHog, if you're out there. Fantastic. Very, very in-depth, just going to help your own journey in developing shmups. So a couple other small things in terms of tips and tricks. So gotchas. So we talked about this briefly, but the rule of thumb is, there we go. So the rule of thumb is never name an image asset the same name. So all that basically means is, like, for instance, if you go into assets, or if you go into your game, you go into Studios, games, DBK, assets, models, enemies. So basically everything is for the most part images, right? So you want to absolutely make sure that, like, for instance, I have this enemy that's called Dark Mage. You do not want to have two of the same named files inside a Shmup Creator, right? You always, every file should be a unique name, and that also counts. So for instance, that's the enemy type, but if you go back to models and you go to bullets, if I have a Dark Mage bullet, so then the engine will be confused because you'll have two images that represent the same thing, and some things can occur. So often it's a mistake that a lot of new developers make, where they think that, oh, I'll just name this the same. I'll name the bullet image and the enemy image the same thing. So even though there are two asset directories that are different, the engine gets confused with that because it needs to know how to relate things, and you need unique file names for that. All right, and then one other thing, you only have one undo, right? So save often, but also make sure that if you find yourself that you broke a bunch of things before you save, you can also quickly go back into Shmup Creator, and you can go back to your load, so you can basically reload and don't do a save there. You can kind of restart from that spot. So yeah, I think those are the main things. Thanks for joining us on this journey to create your own shmup. I can't wait to see what you guys get up to. I hope this was helpful. I know it's tough that there's so much information. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them down in the description, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.